This is Metro Week. Our top story, the local election results. We'll discuss the stunning defeat of all 7 county bond questions and what comes next. Then our Journalists Roundtable analyzes the results.
Welcome to Metro Week. I'm Andrea Kelly. The dust has settled from Tuesday's vote, and the biggest decision voters made was to reject all of the PIMA County bonds. We'll talk about what that means, but first, a review of the message voters sent. For the most part, voters made definitive election decisions. That was the case in the Tucson City Council races, in which all 3 Democrats running for re-election kept their seats. The mayor was unopposed on the ballot and says the results mean the city is on the right track. On the horizon are the annual budget challenges, with the city facing a $40 million deficit at the end of the fiscal year. Rothschild says that means the council begins a new term in December with a question.
In that long-run view, we really have to look at, are there different structures for doing business, for delivering services? The Regional Transit Authority is on everybody's mind. Looking at sales tax.
One committee spent the election cycle trying to convince voters the city council's makeup needed a change. Though all the incumbents won their races, the highly visible opposition campaign shook things up.
I think a lot of people didn't realize what a sad shape Tucson was in, the 5th poorest city, 1 in 3 children in poverty. And I think we gave a voice and let a lot of people have a voice.
The city governance changes passed, but raises for the council failed. Tucson voters overwhelmingly agreed to get rid of red light cameras and photo radar vans. City officials say the cameras stopped issuing citations on Thursday. In Oro Valley, 3 council members and the mayor faced a recall election, and all prevailed. The recall effort began after the council voted to purchase El Conquistador Country Club and make it a town park and recreation center. Now to the bonds. Voters had 7 questions for a total of $816 million in possible borrowing and up to 99 projects. Voters said no to all 7 for the first time in county borrowing history.
They've had it with the spending. They've had it with the taxes. And they want PIMA County to have some fiscal responsibility. And then, as we get most of the debt paid off, who knows? Maybe all these would have passed if we didn't have a debt and the taxes weren't going up.
Now we'll find out what the bond vote means for people who use parks throughout the county. Chris Kawine is director of PIMA County's Natural Resources, Parks and Recreation Department. He says finding other funding for parks projects will be difficult. So parks was one of the 7 questions on the ballot, one of the biggest dollar amounts, and had the most projects. It had almost half of the projects in the whole list. What was your role in helping the Bond Advisory Committee whittle that list down and decide what was going to be on the ballot?
Well, we heard from a lot of different constituents over the years and analyzed the needs of the community and the lack of facilities at certain locations, particularly in areas that are growing parts of town. We heard from other municipalities, and we heard from different constituents about certain things that were quite stressed as far as the use of the facilities and where additional facilities might be required. So that information was then put forth into bond projects, which were introduced to the Bond Advisory Committee for their consideration.
And then they whittled the list down to the 49 that made it.
Exactly. We did some pre-analysis of it, but for the most part it was the Bond Advisory Committee that whittled it down.
Now, would you have been involved in helping to implement all of the projects? They were all over the place: Tucson, Marana, Oro Valley, Sahuarita, and Pima County. Or would you have just been involved in the ones that are in unincorporated Pima County?
Well, we would have been involved to some degree because it was a Pima County bond proposal. So there would have been intergovernmental agreements that would have been necessary to craft, and there would have been an element of oversight in how the projects were completed. For the most part, our day-to-day involvement would have been mostly with the county bond projects. The day-to-day involvement would have been less for the large number of projects that were in the city of Tucson and some of the other municipalities.
So for those projects that were in unincorporated Pima County that you had jurisdiction over in your department, what happens now? How do you either try to get them done or go without them? How do you manage this?
Well, that's a very good question, because it's one of those things that the needs for these projects were pretty strong, And some of the projects stronger than others. Obviously, the projects won't get built at this point in time now over this next period of time. So we hope to go back at some point and try to implement some of the smaller projects at least. However, the time frame would be extended much more significantly as far as the implementation, just because there's not much cushion in our budget to implement large projects. There's absolutely no capacity for, with our limited budget, to implement these big projects. And some of the big projects are for, new park facilities in particular.
So where would the money come from if you're trying to work on them piecemeal or the small ones first?
Well, we do have a limited capacity in our operating budget, which is out of the general fund for the county. We also have pretty good partnerships that we've established with some folks, so we would be working more closely even with our partners to see if those folks can step up and to help. We have a huge volunteer cadre that really help us in the operation of our facilities, and actually construction, not so much. I mean, we have, these are mostly big construction projects, these parks facilities, these new ones in the bond. So actually the only construction we could do would be a limited project. For instance, if we had a creation of a significant pathways and that kind of thing, where we had a trailhead, for instance, we'd have a large parking lot or something that would be striped and it would be asphalt covered and it would have maybe drinking fountains and restrooms and that kind of thing. Maybe we end up doing a much more rudimentary project that would be a gravel covered parking lot or something like that for a trailhead. So we'll be looking at efficiencies to see if there's any way that we can implement some of these projects in a small way, but for the most part, obviously when you have this kind of a large bond project list, there's very little capacity within our $17 million operating budget to handle many more new projects.
Now, are there any nonprofit groups that raise money for parks, like there is for the Pima County Library, that could help maybe sponsor a project or two or 10?
Certainly, yeah. We have the Pima County Parklands Foundation, which is sort of a nonprofit entity who does a lot of work. We've worked with them over the years to implement various parts of various projects. Canoa Preserve in Green Valley has been one of them, in fact, that they've actually, through some of the local donations to the Parklands Foundation, we've been able to do a lot of work through some of the work of some of the folks down there to try to implement money, generate a bunch of money, submit it to Parklands, and then Parklands distributes it for the construction of some projects. So yeah, we look forward to that kind of an approach with Parklands. People can also donate directly to the Parks Department for, we have set up accounts for certain causes, certain areas that people really who want to donate or, contribute to certain elements that they're passionate about. This is a great way to do it, and we can, implement some more projects associated with that.
Chris Kawine of the Pima County Natural Resources, Parks and Recreation Department, thanks for coming in. Now we'll ask what the bond vote means to the local economy. The Tucson Metro Chamber supported the bond package. Robert Medler is the organization's government affairs leader, and he joined me this week to sort through what the regional options are to continue economic development initiatives. Economic development was a big part of the bond, not just the direct questions about that, but a lot of the other projects that people argued would help create jobs or attract people to the area. So what's next now that the bond's failed?
I think the first thing is to wait for the canvas to come out. Everyone's very surprised all of the bond questions went down at honestly rather sizable gaps, except for flood control on the roads. They were pretty close, within 4 or 5 points, but the rest of them failed 2 to 1 almost. And so waiting for the final canvas to come out to really see how this year's rather odd election, with the recall, with the joint ballot between all of the jurisdictions, how did that drive the vote, I think is our next step. After that, we're really going to have to identify the projects that really need to go forward.
So what will be the funding options for those projects that still need to happen?
That's probably the biggest question out there. Some of them likely will be potentially going back to the voters with bonds. I think a great example of that is the $5 million for Davis-Monthan. A lot of people don't know that there is private land within the fence line of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base that the Air Force writes a check every other year to those property owners. We, along with other people, have a large concern that when the Air Force gets to having to do a BRAC in the next few years, that's a hit against Davis-Monthan, that you have private owners with land within the fence line of Davis-Monthan. It's about a $5 million purchase. That's a great use of bonding. We can get the money. It'd be very small on all the taxpayers, but would people be willing to increase their taxes? Probably no more than $1 or $2 to pay that off in a year or two to save almost $1 billion impact. That's one that could go back to bonds. Some of the other projects are going to have to get creative. We were big supporters of the road bonds. That was really a stipulation of us supporting the bond package, was getting money for roads. That's what our members have told us is one of the largest priorities for them.
And that one also failed. I mean, they
that
all
one failed,
right?
yes. So, how do you fix it? A lot of people think bonding for roads is not smart finance, is not good fiscal policy, and it's not, but there's not a lot of other options. So you need to bond for them and get the money in and fix it, or you're gonna keep having the same roads. Even if all the money that comes from the state and the feds goes straight in the pavement preservation, we still don't have enough money to do that. And that's a national problem, but we're focused here locally. How do we fix our roads?
So in the Chamber's opinion, is the Tucson area's future really at stake? Was this a vote that really changes Tucson's future?
I'm not sure if it changes the future. I think it would have definitely taken steps in the right direction, but what we have across the board really is more of the same. And so I think, yes, in the short term, what's our plan, what's our answer? We're gonna wait for the canvas, see how the vote went, of how to take things back to the voters potentially. But we're also waiting for the people who led the no vote on the bonds to come back with their own plan. What are you gonna do for economic development? What are you gonna do for the roads? What's a viable option? Because really it was mudslinging and a lot of misinformation going around. You need to have solutions that are viable and take them to the voters. If you didn't like this plan, that's fine. What's your solution?
So even though voters overwhelmingly rejected most of these bonds, turnout was low. How big of a deal do you think that is in where this package ended up?
Voter turnout is probably the biggest thing about this election. We have about 565,000 voters registered to vote in PIMA County, which is pretty good. When you think of a population of 1 million, kids, anyone under 18 can't vote. So we have a rather high voter registration. You had 305,000 ballots mailed out. So that means people get them in the mailbox. Of that, only about 50% came back. It was a little under that. And so that's people who get the ballot in their mailbox and can't stuff it back in the envelope after filling it out and sending it back in. Don't even have to put Post-its on it. So we really need to work as a community of getting people to understand the importance of that. When you take the rest of the people who didn't get that 250,000, only 11% of them showed up to the polls on election day. That's very, very low. And so I think as a community, we need to talk about civic engagement, the importance of voting. Maybe everyone could have had 100% voter turnout, and maybe they went the same way, but at least you have the engagement. Right now, some of the school districts we were talking about before, 4,500 people made a decision on whether to issue general obligation bonds or not.
Right.
That's a very small amount of the population deciding future of our children.
And that's why some of them remain still too close to call.
Correct.
Because there's just so few votes.
Right. It'd be a lot different if there was 30, 40,000 votes in a school district deciding if a 10% override or bonding or issuing bonds for $20, $40 million for improvement to your schools that, if you have kids, your kids are going to, or your grandkids are going to. It's local, it's under your control. It's what everyone says they want to support or how they want things to work. But when it comes to them, they're not supporting it. That, I think, doesn't speak to people being opposed to it. It's people not showing up to vote for it.
Robert Medler of the Tucson Metro Chamber, thanks for coming in and telling us where we stand right now.
My pleasure, Andrew.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Tonight on Arizona Week, the governor dives into the details of his education spending plan.
We know this puts $3.5 billion in money into the base formula in K-12 education. That's what's important. We're going to stay focused on the goals.
Now our Journalist Roundtable. Joining me to analyze the election results are Becky Palak of the Arizona Daily Star, Dan Shearer of the Green Valley News and Sahuarita Sun, and former Arizona Daily Star journalist Joe Burchell. Thanks to each of you for coming in today. Joe, I'm going to start with you and ask you, voters have typically approved the Pima County bond elections, and this is the first time they've wholesale turned down all those questions. Should we have seen this coming? Was this a surprise?
I would say I was dumbfounded. It's that extreme. I've covered government 40 years. I have never seen voters say to everything. It's unheard of. Years and years, the most common complaint, roads, they're awful, do something about them. They vote no. I didn't expect them all to pass. I expected at least 2 or 3 to pass. They failed. What I'm still trying to get a handle on is what the real message is. Everybody wants Tucson to be a better place, but apparently everybody wants somebody else to pay for it. I don't know, like analysis, I don't know how much deeper it can go because we haven't seen the canvas. We don't know where they voted yes. We don't know where they voted no. We just know across the board people said no, and I've never seen anything like it in 40 years in Tucson journalism.
Dan, we talked on previous journalist roundtables about the incremental tax increases we've been seeing throughout jurisdictions in the past few years, and we wondered if that would have an impact on this bond election. Now that we have the numbers, 7 no's, is that one of the reasons?
I think for sure it had to be a reason. The county tax rate went up 17% last year. It went up again this year. We had school bonds. We had school overrides. We have Social Security and Medicare not performing the way people want. And then here we have a county that's saying, hey, we're going to build a velodrome. We're going to buy $95 million of dirt. We're going to buy a park just to fly model airplanes. And people thought, no, it's silly. So I disagree with Joe. I don't think we were saying we don't want a better Tucson. We don't want a better PIMA County. We're saying we want it done a different way, and bonds is not the way to maintain roads. It's a bad thing, and I think people finally caught on to that.
Well, some of the elected officials were saying, though, it might be a bad way, but it's the only way we have. And that's something that we see that voters have voted for road bonds in the past and this time said, no, we don't want that.
Right, but then you're getting it into that pattern of now this is the only way and this is going to be our standard way of doing it in the future. And we were telling people down there, and we did not endorse the road bond for this very reason. Make them do it the right way. We understand that the state has swept a lot of money. We understand that they're up against a lot, but bonds is not the way to do it. And we felt like there were a lot of really good projects on there, a lot of really good projects. But overall, there were a lot of silly projects too. And I think people finally were given enough question marks that they just said no. And I was a little surprised. But in the last 2 or 3 weeks before the election, I really kind of noticed a sea change through the emails and through the phone calls and just through public sentiment. So at the end of the day, I was a little surprised that they all went down, but not completely.
And then, Becky, I want to ask you about another potential cause of this. In your interviews leading up to the election, or maybe on election night, what about the concept of voters' lack of trust in government? Is that something that played into this?
I didn't hear much of that. I heard a lot more about personal finance. I heard several people give the same story about opening their property tax bill and getting a shock and then voting no.
Property tax bill in the mail and then potentially the ballot in the mail a few weeks later.
They came really close in time there. And then, for a lot of people, it feels like the recession never ended. A lot of major employers in Tucson are talking about layoffs. It just didn't seem like the right time to say yes to spending more.
Now, one thing you brought up, Joe, was that we won't quite be able to analyze all of these results until we have the official canvas.
Yes.
That takes a few weeks before that gets actually officially approved, but it's Friday, and we still don't even have all the votes counted in PIMA County. And this is seeming to be a trend. Every year, we have a wait until we know the final election results. What's going on with the PIMA County vote count?
Historically, 20 years ago, I was able to call virtually every race before 10 p.m. Now I can't call them 10 days later. Part of it is the change in how we have elections. A lot of it goes to so many mail-in ballots that get dropped off at the polling place on election day. They have to be verified. They can't be counted in a close race. But the other piece, which I think is what you're getting to, is Maricopa County has the same thing and hundreds of thousands of more voters. They're still light years ahead of us.
The same technology, you mean?
The same technology. It's like nobody is selling technology to Maricopa County only. It's available to everybody. Everybody is ahead of us. I think part of it goes back to the county is excessively cautious because they got called out on maybe we flipped the votes, maybe we didn't flip the votes.
In the 2006 RTA election.
Right, in the RTA election, and I think that they put some things in place that delay the vote count. And then beyond that, there's no explanation, there's no excuse for it, and I don't know. Becky, you were there election night. What did you see?
Yeah, we saw some glitches in the results early on. At first, the total number of registered voters that was reflected on the results page was too high or too low. It was different from the Arizona Secretary of State count. And then partway through the night on election results, they dropped the precinct count completely from the page, so no one could tell what portion of the polling place ballots had been counted. So problems continue.
And Dan, you've been on the phone with tried to be on the phone with the county elections director. So have we at Arizona Public Media. And what are you hearing?
I have no problem with being excessively careful, and I'm sure you don't either. But yeah, this is embarrassing almost for us. We have got a race down in the Continental School District that is too close to call. And just a few years ago, they actually lost an override by 1 vote. And now we're in a very close situation. The numbers from Tuesday night it's not losing as bad as it was now on Wednesday. And now we didn't get anything on Thursday. And here it is Friday. And they need to develop strategies for next year, and it's important that they do it as quickly as possible and strike while the iron's hot and people are talking about it. And so we need those results.
And these odd year elections always have a lower turnout than the even numbered year elections. With the presidential election next year, all of Congress, the state offices, county offices,
right.
And local elections, I mean, we're just going to have much fuller ballots, more things to count. So getting it in shape by next year sounds like a good idea. But
it sounds like a great idea. I don't think it's going to happen, and I think we're going to be waiting 2, 3, 4 weeks even for final results next year.
So, piling on what he said, it was a good idea last year to do it for this year. It was a good idea. Mm-hmm. You know, this is just a repetitive cycle. It's always a good idea to make it right for next year.
Yeah. So are you guys saying that we, journalists and voters, should change our expectations and just know that it's going to take a week or more, weeks sometimes, to find out about election results?
Well, maybe we should find out why it didn't take weeks for Maricopa County this time. And I'm not saying it's going that long, but it's gone too long here in PIMA County. So what are we doing wrong? Is it that they don't have the right machinery? Is it that they don't have the right management? Is it, what is it? And maybe it's just not important to the county. I don't know what the answer is, but now is the time to ask those questions, because it is important to get those results as quickly as possible.
How important was turnout in this election, Dan?
You know, the turnout was much higher than I thought it would be. They'll tell you that there are 565,000 registered voters here, but the fact is about 70,000 voters are pretty much off the rolls because they were mailed ballots and they came back. So those are inactive voters. So roughly we have 500,000 people who voted. And so I think the turnout is actually, if you count it that way, is over 30%. So I think the more people who turned out, the less chance the bonds had. And that's what we saw. I heard projections as low as 15% at one point, and if it had been that, I think the bonds would have just sailed on through. But people jumped on board, and I'm fairly satisfied with the turnout. I do think it was probably in the 32-33% range if you discount those voters who the ballot went to their homes and nobody was there.
Just to check something, I think you said about 500,000 people voted. You meant could have voted, were
right, registered. Registered, okay. Correct.
All right, and then Becky, we haven't talked a lot about the school districts so far in the show. Can you run through some of the results? Those were financial questions as well, but they didn't all follow the trend that the bonds followed.
Right, so in addition to the too close to call bond override in Continental, there was 2 questions in Catalina Foothills that both passed. One was a bond issue for renovations for their schools, and the other was a capital budget override. The other that passed was in Flowing Wells, which was a 10% budget override that they want to spend to hire teachers and to help pay for all-day kindergarten, which I think is an issue, especially all-day kindergarten, that voters can really support. There were also, Sunnyside asked for a bond override for the same, a budget override for the same reason, and theirs failed. Mm-hmm. And also we had a Sahuarita question that was asking for money to build a new school, among other things. That also failed.
Dan, what's the impact of those Green Valley and Sahuarita area districts?
Well, the Sahuarita district was asking for a $40 million bond. $25 million of that would have gone to build a new school. We know the school facilities district is simply not giving districts money to put up buildings anymore, so we're kind of on our own. They're definitely going to have to come back. But I think the district did a fairly poor job of explaining where all the money was going, and people thought it was just too much. But you look at also 7 bond issues, $815 million plus this, I think people just went no all the way down.
Joe, for some of the districts that did have their bonds passed, is that contradictory when we read into these results with the county-wide bond failing, some schools getting some money?
No, I don't think it's really contradictory in that the school bonds It was easy to identify what the money was for, and this is something that I value. Although in Sahuarita, I thought that Sahuarita put a higher value on education than apparently they do. The bonds were so diffuse.
Countywide bonds.
The countywide bonds were so diffuse, and I think there was an element of things that were kind of dumb, dragging things that were kind of good down with them. If they're throwing this at me, can this be good? So no, I don't think it's contradictory. I think it's, I understand this and I want this. I want my kid to have an all-day kindergarten, or I want my kid to have
better education.
Yeah, a better education. So I don't think it's too much to be read into that.
All right, I want to ask you about a character you have known for many years, John Kromko. He was in on the show talking about his red light camera initiative, and as we know, voters overwhelmingly said, stop the photo radar, stop the red light cameras. But historically, he's had some trouble getting his initiatives on the ballot. So how did he get this one on?
Actually, okay, that was the least surprising. As soon as that was on the ballot, it was passed. And I guess I would say, actually, John, when it comes to roads, has had phenomenal success.
Okay.
John was the author of what's called the Neighborhood Protection Amendment, which essentially bans grade separated interchanges. He passed petitions. The city took him to court to try to get him knocked off the ballot. He won in court. He got him on the ballot. He was one of the leaders of the opposition of a city sales tax for roads. He won on that one. He opposed the Speedway Tunnel. He won on that. So he has had his finger on the pulse, at least when it comes to transportation. He is where the public is, and the public is not in favor of red light cameras and speed vans.
Clearly not, overwhelmingly not.
But I have to give John credit. He is on top of that one when it comes to transportation.
And Becky, the city already has made some decisions about the future of those cameras.
Right, so the cameras, at least as of Thursday, were still taking pictures, so drivers might have seen the flash from the camera, but the police department is no longer issuing citations based on those photos. The question we still don't really have an answer to is when the city is going to turn off the cameras and take down the equipment, or how quickly that could happen.
All right, and I want to ask you also about the Tucson City Council election. We saw all the incumbents win. What can we take away from those results?
Well, the incumbents are saying that people like what they're seeing in terms of progress on the council, and they want that momentum to continue.
And Mayor Jonathan Rothschild, who was unopposed on the ballot, is now talking about what's next in terms of potentially regional transit, a half-cent sales tax. What is he talking about when he talks about this potentially trying to get a new tax?
Right, so he wants to start a conversation with the community about a potential half-cent sales tax that could be used, depending on what the public wants to do with it, either to help pay for public safety, police pensions, something like that, or it could be used to help pay for transit. We just came out of the Suntran bus strike, and the city still has to deal with how they're going to pay for transit in the future.
And Joe, that means we stay with one-party rule in the Tucson City Council, 7 Democrats. Is that an effective way to have our city governance function?
I don't know that having seven Democrats and having no vocal, loyal opposition is the best thing. I will say that until this election, I was a supporter of the existing system that we have.
Functionally, the way the government was structured.
Yes, and we always had people who came along. Lou Murphy, Republican mayor, but Democratic council. Roy Laus was a Republican. We've had a number of Republicans who kept the other side of an issue on the table. The Republicans ran, by and large, better candidates this year than they have run in past city elections. They still got swept. Mm-hmm. I think that says something. You know, we have the perception that there's dissatisfaction with government, but the incumbents all won. Mm-hmm. Does it speak to the fact that people like government the way it is? Or does it speak to the fact that the system is broken? I don't know. We have to wait for more results.
There's a lot of things we're still trying to figure out about this election. Becky?
And there's the ongoing question about whether the election system itself, in terms of ward-only versus citywide elections,
yes.
The Ward 4 Republican candidate, Margaret Burkholder, had made the comment on election night that she probably wouldn't run again unless it was a ward-only. We have to wait for the final results to find out if Margaret won in the ward but lost citywide.
Which typically happens in those wards 2 and 4 on the city's east side that have more Republican voters. That's all the time we have for today. I appreciate all of you coming in. If you want more detail on the results of any of these races, you'll find it on our Election Center online. Next week, we're picking up a story we began a few weeks ago. We talked with economists who said the Tucson economy lags in part because of reduced federal spending. So next week, we'll look at how the city of Tucson gets some of that money and where it goes. Thanks for watching.